Subject interpretation of statutes. Two sentence answers. Question number 1. What is immovable property under General Clauses Act? So section 3 subsection 26 defines immovable property. Immovable property shall include land, benefits to arise out of land, and things attached to the earth, or permanently fastened to anything attached to the earth. In Santabai versus State of Bombay, the Supreme Court pointed out that the trees must be regarded as immovable property because they are attached to or rooted in the earth. Question 2. Person under General Clauses Act. Section 3, subsection 42 defines person. Person shall include any company or association or body of individuals, whether corporated or not. Question 3. Good faith under General Clause Act. Section 3, subsection 22. A thing shall be deemed to be done in good faith where it is in fact done honestly, whether it is done negligently or not. The question of good faith under the General Clauses Act is one of fact. It is to determine with respect to the circumstances of each case. Question 4. Father, vessel under General Clauses Act. Father. Section 3, subsection 20 defines father. Father in the case of anyone whose personal law permits adoption shall include an adoptive father. Section 3, subsection 63 vessel. Vessel shall include any ship or boat or any other description of vessel used in navigation. Question 5. Explain delegatus non potest delegare. This means a delegated power cannot be further delegated. This is the fundamental principle of delegated legislation. If a delegating authority delegates a power to another authority and that another authority has no power to delegate the same again. Question 6. State and explain the rule of literal construction. Giving words their ordinary and natural meaning is known as literal interpretation or literalages. It is the duty of the court not to modify the language of the act, and if such meaning is clear and unambiguous, effect should be given to the provisions of a statute, whether may be the consequence. What is a codifying statute? A codifying statute is a statute which states exhaustively the whole of the law upon a particular subject. The purpose of codifying statute is to present uniform, orderly, and authoritative rules on a particular subject. For example, the Hindu Succession Act 1956 is a codifying statute with respect to intestate succession among Hindus. Explain the importance of historical background as an aid to interpretation. To look into the mischief which had to be cured as well as to the cure provided, the subject matter with which the legislature was dealing, and the facts existing at the time with respect to which the legislature was legislating are legitimate topics to consider in ascertaining what was the object and purpose of the legislature in passing the act. Name any three internal aids to statutory interpretation. Title, short and long, preamble, schedules, headings, and marginal notes, sections, subsections. These are the internal aids to the statutory interpretation. What is the purpose of interpretation of statutes? Interpretation is the primary function of a court. The court interprets the legislature whenever a dispute comes before it. Since the will of the legislature is expressed generally in the form of a statute, the prime concern of the court is to find out the intention of the legislature in the language used by the legislature in the statute. What is sententia legis? The maxim sententia legis or mens means that the essence of the law lies in the spirit and not in its letter. The letters are just the way to express the intentions of the lawmakers. The words are the external manifestation of intention that it involves. What is the doctrine of pith and substance? The doctrine of pith and substance states that if the substance of legislation fails within a legislature's lawful power, the legislation does not become unconstitutional just because it impacts an issue beyond its area of authority. True nature and character is what the phrase pith and substance signifies. Define interpretation of statutes. Interpretation is the process by which the real meaning of an act or a document and the intention of the legislature in enacting it or of the parties executing the document is ascertained. It is the duty of the court to interpret the act and give meaning to each word of the statute. Define son as defined in the General Clauses Act 1897. Son is the case of anyone whose personal law permits adoption shall include an adopted son. What is casus omissus? Casus omissus literally means case omitted. It is an application of the principle that a matter which should have been but has not been provided for in a statute cannot be supplied by courts, as to do so will be legislation and not construction. Explain the doctrine of eclipse. The doctrine of eclipse under Indian laws is a legal doctrine that states that any existing law which is inconsistent with fundamental rights does not completely become invalid. It can be made valid if appropriate amendments are made to the constitution, making that impugned law in sync with the fundamental rights. Explain the rule of nociter a socies. Nocere means to know and socies means association. Therefore, nociter a socies means to know from the association. When two or more words which are susceptible to an analogous meaning are put together, they are to be understood in their cognate sense. Define coming into operation of an act as defined in the General Clauses Act 1897. Under Section 5 of the Act, where any central act is not expressed to come into operation on a particular day, then it shall come into an operation on the day on which it receives the assent. In the case of central act made before the commencement of the constitution of the Governor General, and in the case of an act of Parliament of the President, unless the contrary is expressed, central act or regulation shall be construed as coming into operation immediately on the expiration of the day preceding its commencement. Explain the role of short title as internal aid of statutory interpretation. The short title merely identifies the enactment and is chosen merely for convenience and it does not describe it. For example, the Indian Penal Code 1860. What is doctrine of repugnancy? Repugnancy means a contradiction between two laws, which when applied to the same set of facts produce different results. The doctrine of repugnancy in accordance to Article 254 states that if any part of state law is repugnant or conflicting to any part of a central law which the parliament is competent to enact or to any part of a law of the matter of list 3, then the central law made by the parliament shall prevail and the law made by the state legislature shall become void to the extent of its repugnancy. What is strict construction of taxing statutes? Statutes imposing taxes or monetary burdens are to be strictly construed. The logic behind this principle is that imposition of taxes is also a kind of imposition of penalty which can only be imposed if the language of the statute unequivocally says no. The right to tax should be clearly established. Equitable construction should not be taken into account. What is directory and mandatory provisions? A mandatory statute is one which compels performance of certain things or compels that a certain thing must be done in a certain matter or form. A directory statute merely directs or permits a thing to be done without compelling its performance. What is doctrine of severability? The doctrine of severability means that when some particular provisions of a statute offends or is against a constitutional limitation, but that provision is severable from the rest of the statute, only that offending provisions will be declared void by the court and not the entire statute. What is the role of long title and preamble as internal aid? Long title. A statute is headed by a long title whose purpose is to give a general description about the object of the act. Preamble. Preamble is the key to open the mind of the legislature and the mischief to be remedied and the scope of the act are described. What is enabling statute? An enabling statute is one which enlarges the common law. Where it is narrow, it makes doing of something lawful which would not be otherwise lawful. Such a statute grants power to make rules, etc., to carry out the purposes of the act, and these rules may be provided for a number of enumerated matters in particular and without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing provisions. Explain the importance of legislative debates in the interpretation of statutes. It is to understand the context, background, and object behind its use of the given expression. A speech made in the course of a debate on a bill could be referred to find out the intent of the speaker. Explain what do you mean by strict construction. Strict construction refers to the interpretation which is made strictly, that adjures each word in legislation must be interpreted by letter, and that interpretation should never go beyond the statute. A close or narrow reading of interpretation is known as a strict construction. In this approach, courts must follow the literal rule. What is the meaning of affidavit? Affidavit shall include affirmation and declaration in the case of persons by law allowed to affirm or declare instead of swearing. It is a document in writing. What is the meaning of an doctrine of absurdity? The doctrine of absurdity holds that common sense interpretation should be preferred to avoid absurd legal conclusions rather than literal readings.